Welcome back to Core CSS Mastery. We're going to be talking about styling text. As we might imagine, text is a fairly large component of the majority of websites, so we'd be fairly lost without some understanding of how to style text using CSS. So we have our code editor on the left, we have our HTML page on the right. It's a fairly simple page. It has 3 headings, making use of H1, H2, H3, and 2 paragraphs. At the bottom of the document, we have a list of different CSS rules that are used to style text. If there were 3 rules, I would say that we must remember, and we're going to be using them on a day-to-day basis. It's the color property, the font size property, and the text align property. So let's start with those. Color is fairly straightforward. We've seen that in the course already. Let's just style our paragraph tag, and let's just give it a color property. And we're going to assign the value to blue, and let's refresh the changes. This is not the only way of defining a color. We can also use its hex code, or we can use its RGB value. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the course. Next, we can set the font size. So let's create a new property, font size, and we'll give it a value in pixels. Let's set the font size to 20 pixels. Similar to colors, there is more than one way to measure sizing in CSS. We'll also get to that later in the course as well. The final rule, which again we should probably just remember rather than rely on the reference docs, is text align. In fact, let's add this to one of our heading elements. So at the moment, we can describe that H1 as being left justified. It's obviously starting at the left-hand side of the page and moving towards the right-hand side of the page. So if we style the H1 tag with text align center, let's see what happens. We can see that it justifies itself to the center. And the other obvious option here is text align right, and our H1 tag is going to justify itself to the right-hand side of the document. Now let's think of some of the other rules we can use to style text. These won't be used as frequently. If you can remember them, great. If not, and you need to reference these from a document somewhere before using them, that's completely fine. You won't use them often enough where it's going to be really important to memorize the names of the properties and values. The first one we're going to look at is font family. Now we can actually be very specific with which font we ask the browser to display. So we could specifically ask for something like Times New Roman, but we can also specify a font family. The options here are serif, sans serif, monospace, cursive, and fantasy. Now we spoke about serif and sans serif a little bit earlier in the course, so let's try out some of those other font families. So what happens if we choose monospace here? So we can see every character takes up exactly the same width now with a monospace font. What is cursive? Let's take a look. So we see a font style that's meant to look like it's been written by hand rather than by a computer. And finally, let's check out fantasy. So we'll talk more about using specific font types a little bit later on in the course. But for now, we can make use of some of these default font families. Let's now think about font weight. This is essentially how bold the font looks. So if we try bold as one of the options, we can see the font has a much bolder typeface now. If we set it to lighter, it should have the opposite effect. Now, if we look at that closely, it appears that lighter and the regular setting are actually the same in this case. So if we completely delete the font weight property and refresh the page, we can see no change in the font whatsoever. So what is the reason for that? Well, the boldness settings that are available are dependent on the font itself. So another thing we can do is actually supply a number for font weight. So for example, we could set a font weight to 300, but whether or not it's going to have any effect is going to completely depend on the font. As you can see in this case, it doesn't work for all numbers, but that 800 is obviously very bold font, and I think it's even bolder than the bold setting. We next have font style, and values for this can be normal, italic, or oblique. Now, oblique is just a type of italic, but rather than a pre-made italic version of the font, it's literally the browser just trying to make an italic version of the current font. Let's try that one out. And let's see if there's any difference between oblique and italic in this case. Now, honestly, this is not a property that I really ever use. And the reason is fairly straightforward. If I wanted an italic, I would actually use the HTML I tag in most cases. Let's try that on the second paragraph. But depending on what we want to achieve, we obviously can actually use CSS to create italics. So you can see there's no real difference there between font style italic and the I tag used in HTML. Text transform is another property that I don't really make use of too much. So settings for this include uppercase, lowercase, capitalize, and full width. So if we were to set this to uppercase, let's have a look. And one of the reasons why this doesn't get used very often is simply if you wanted all caps, you might just have all caps in HTML itself. But it's good to know that this is an option where we can actually control upper and lower case using CSS. Now, if we style that H1 tag, one of the properties I do like to make use of is the text shadow. And text shadow takes 4 values, and you can see them referred to here in the notes. So we have 1 horizontal offset, 2 vertical offset, and 3 blur radius. So these 3 are all sizings. You can use pixels for these. And finally, 4 is the shadow color. So let's just experiment with this. What is the offset, first of all? Well, if we just put in some random values, let's just set 5 pixels for everything, and then let's set the color of the shadow to be aqua. Let's see what that looks like. Now let's work backwards from that third value, the blur radius. So the larger this value, the larger the shadow, but the more washed out the shadow is going to appear. So for example, if we set this to 10 pixels, the shadow is going to be even bigger, but it's going to be a lot less defined. It's almost like the element's much further away from the backdrop. You can see there's kind of a 3D effect that's taking place here. If we set the blur radius to a smaller value, the shadow is going to be slightly smaller, but it's going to be much better defined. Let's take a look at that. Now we have a nice sharp shadow there. In reality, this doesn't look that great. So let's have a look at the other 2 values, which are the offsets. Now, just to illustrate what these do, if I give a very high value to that first offset, let's set it to 20 pixels. You can see the shadow moves along horizontally by 20 pixels. Now, the reason why this doesn't look very good is just because these values are too high. If we were to set this to 3 pixels for both the vertical and horizontal offset, that's a slightly better effect. In fact, we could even make that to 2 pixels. It's also useful to keep in mind that we can use negative values if we want the shadow to swing to the other side. So we can see now the shadow is appearing towards the top and towards the left rather than the bottom and the right. Now let's reduce the size of this blue font slightly to 10 pixels. And let's set it back to the default font family. And let's get rid of those uppercase characters. And that's slightly small, so let's set it to 20, set it to 15. So next we have the line height property, and what this does is controls the amount of vertical space a line of text has. So if I set this to 20 pixels, we'll see the effect straight away. You can see that there's now more space between the lines. If we set this to 50 pixels, we'd get probably quite a strange effect, maybe good for poetry or something. But you can see we have a lot of flexibility and customizability here with these CSS options. We might not use this in most cases, but it's good to know it's there and we can achieve this kind of effect. Now, in a similar way, if you understand what line height does, then you have a pretty good idea of what letter spacing does. So let's set that to 15 pixels and see what happens. So you can see between the letters, there's a 15 pixel space. And we also have word spacing, which should be fairly self-explanatory as well. Let's set 50 pixels between each word. Other effects which you may not have realized you can run with CSS is the text direction, and we can use a writing mode property for this. Just take a moment to look at the options a code editor is giving us. We have horizontal, sideways LR, sideways RL, vertical LR, and vertical RL. So let's try some of these options. So sideways and LR stands for left to right in this context. Let's have a look what happens here. So you can see we now have our paragraphs sideways. If we were to change the order of the LR, it's still going to be sideways, but it's going to run in the other direction. Let's take a look at that. You can see it's flipped around. Now at the moment, this is vertical, but the text is still sideways. So it's actually possible to have this vertical and the text be vertical as well. So we can do that with the vertical LR property. Let's try that. And to complete the effect, we'd need to make use of a text orientation property. and we'll give the value upright and take a look at this effect. So you can see we're actually reading from top to bottom now. Let's reset that paragraph text for now, and let's set the color back to black. And let's try typing the property text decoration line. So this allows us to add a line to our text. Well, why would we want a line in our text? Well, it could be an underline, could be an overline, or it could be a strike through. So let's underline the text. So that's fairly self-explanatory. Another thing we can do is set a text decoration color, and we can set that to whatever color we want. So that has actually turned blue. It's not really easy to see, so let's try red. There we go, that's clearly underlined. We can also specify both an underline and an overline if we want to. It doesn't have to be one or the other, it can be both. And the other thing we can do is specify a strike through. So the value in CSS for that is line hyphen through. So this is to give the effect that we've crossed out certain text. And once again, we can use that in conjunction with the others. I have no idea why you'd ever do that. So let's just leave the underline for now. And we'll look at one final property and value associated with this, which is text decoration style. So let's just have a look at the available properties there. We have dashed, dotted, double, solid. Let's try wavy. And we can't really customize everything right now, but we can even take this further. You can see we have a text decoration thickness. So let's set that to 10 pixels. Let's see what happens. So you can see that's obviously ridiculous. We don't want that. Let's try 2 pixels. There you go. So we have a nice thick wavy underline. Now we covered a lot in this session. This is just as a sample so you can see what's possible. In terms of what you need to know as part of core CSS mastery, it's just really these properties and values here. Make sure you know and have memorized how to set the color of text, how to set the size of text, and how to set the alignment of text, whether it's left justified, center justified, or right justified. And some of the others could definitely be helpful, but it's okay if you just want to look these up as and when you need them. They'll eventually stick around in your memory anyway. All right, thanks very much for watching, guys. Catch you in the next part of the course.